that, let's get started. Today's webinar is titled Crucial Conversations. How effective are you at those difficult conversations? Our presenter is alumna Joanne Humbert, Associate Director of Organizational Development in the Human Resources Department at RIT. Here is where she oversees the Center for Professional Development. Her group is responsible for the professional development training of all employees, a value-based leadership program for all leaders, and oversight for communication training and standards for the Finance and Administration Division. Joanne has more than 25 years in higher education administration experience, which includes the Director of Online Learning and Director of Academic Technology at RIT, where she oversaw media development for courses, web services, and emerging technology initiatives. Joanne has served on several advisory boards, including the NMC Horizon Report, National University Telecommunications Network, has served as a reviewer for the New York State Education Department Office of Higher Education for several institutional capability reviews for distance learning, and she was former pillar editor of the Sloan C Consortium. Joanne holds a BA in English Literature from Villa Maria College and an MS in Instructional Technology from RIT. She also holds a Six Sigma Green Belt, DISC, and Crucial Conversations certifications, as well as additional certifications in the training and development areas. Joanne, let's get going.
We are ready. That was a mouthful, Cindy. Thanks so much, and thank you to everyone who's joining me today. I'm excited to talk about Crucial Conversations. I really believe in this stuff, and it really works. So I hope that you'll join me for the next 50 minutes or so, and together we'll reflect on some difficult conversations, and hopefully you'll walk away with a few things to try out on your next difficult conversation or before you go into that conversation. You know, it was funny. This morning I came into my office and my mail was waiting for me. And I get the Harvard Business Review in print. I like to read it in print. I can take it and travel with it and do whatever I want. But anyway, the title of the most recent edition, which was on the cover, was How to Really Learn from Failure. And I sort of giggled to myself thinking, well, that's sort of what we do in Crucial Conversations. We look at our difficult conversations from the past, ones that either didn't go well or didn't go as well as we wanted maybe, and we dissect them and we look at our role and what we said, what we didn't say, what we wanted to say, what we should have said, and then we try and make those tweaks and improve our future conversations. So today, I'm going to ask you to think about a frustrating conversation because we'll use it later in the presentation for you to reflect on so that some of this you can apply right to a conversation you had. I don't want to make you too unhappy, but I do want you to think about a frustrating conversation you had and something you can use when we do our activity. And you'll also want to have a piece of paper by your side because you'll write down a few things as we go through it. So let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do here. And some of you had a chance to answer these questions. We're going to go back to that in a little while. But today we're going to talk about, what really is the cost of a difficult conversation. And we'll talk about the book and the model. The book is called Crucial Conversations. It was on the bestseller list for many years. It's a recommended reading for most leaders. And it's very helpful, and there's a 16-hour training that goes along with that. And a few years ago, I and a few others from RIT were certified to provide this training here. It's obviously a long training, and not one we're going to have a chance to go through entirely today. So I've chosen one activity and one aspect of the Crucial Conversations to talk with you about today. And then in the end, we'll talk about, well, how can I use this information? How can I use this information in future conversations? So let's jump right into the cost of poor communication. I think let's look at it really in reference to the workplace. Most leaders or managers don't come into the workplace by thinking, gee, I think I'll irritate Tom today, or I'll ignore my employees today. But it does happen. Life happens, projects happen, and sometimes you blow by things that maybe you should have stopped and taken a little time for. But it happens, and by not recognizing the importance of good communications, leaders can incur significant costs to their organizations. So this information comes from an article titled The Cost of Poor Communications. It's done by the Grossman Group, communication consultants. And the data they collected in a survey of more than 400 companies with over 10,000 employees, they found it cost $37 billion as a result of employee misunderstanding. And by misunderstanding, I mean, you know, actions or errors or omission by employees who have misunderstood or who were misinformed about company policies, processes, job functions, or some sort of combination of the three. The average cost per company was $62 million, and the cost per worker per year, $26,000. So these are huge numbers, and whether you work for a large corporation or not, you can still imagine that there is a cost to the company for your miscommunication or your ineffective communication. And later on, I'm going to share a little information about, you know, what happens to the well-being of the employee when difficult conversations either happen or conversations don't happen in the work environment. So in this article, they shared a result from Best Buy, and they found that the higher the employee engagement scores led to better store performance. And the company found that for every percentage point it boosted employee engagement, individuals saw a $100,000 increase in operating. So, you know, what does this mean? It just means that paying attention to how you communicate, what you communicate, how you ensure that it resonates with the person you're communicating with and you share information makes a huge difference. And it's important as managers, because we model what others see in the workplace, it's important for managers and leaders to be extra skilled at this. So let's, you know, talking about those communications, we're going to take a look at what exactly the poll said to us about what do you do when you were a child and you wanted to get your way. Can we take a look at those results? Okay. So it looks like about 23 answered, or is that 23 that didn't answer, Cindy?
That's 23 with no answer.
Okay. So the rest of you said, you know, 12 of you said you did what you were told. You never asked. These are the people, the rule followers. They're the obeyers. And actually, those were some of the first people that answered when the poll went up. So I know that you obeyed when you were a child because you answered right away when the poll went up. So 12 of you did what you were told. About 9 of you used some other techniques, whining, pouting, temper tantrums, persisting, you know, that activity where you keep asking until you're either told no or they give up and give you what you want. Some of you found that successful. And 7 of you just did what you wanted and then asked the permission later. And then some smarter ones got a no from one and went to the other parent. And some actually have a different way of handling it. So there's a range here, and really, when you think about it, the range usually is from being silent, you know, shutting down, not responding, or going to the other extreme of much more aggressive or outward expression of your disappointment, and that may be your whining, your pouting, your temper tantrums. You're arguing, that kind of thing. And usually there is that range. And if you think about it, you know, and you look at this list, I would ask you, and I'm not asking for a yes or no, you can just answer for yourself, but I would ask you, does this happen, do you recognize some of these behaviors in the workplace? Do you see those people? Now, they may not be throwing themselves on the floor and pounding their fists on the ground, but I've seen temper tantrums in the workplace, and I would suspect you have too. You've seen nagging, you've seen whining, pouting. You've seen people who just do what they're told without asking. So I think what we can realize from all of this is that you do see some of these same behaviors. They are in a range from shutting down to acting out. And it happens, and as you mature, you change the strategies a little bit, but that's exactly what happens in the workplace. So all of this tells us what, you know, this sort of contributes to why crucial conversations and why we look at it. So I want to explain sort of what is crucial conversations. And there's three elements to a crucial conversation. When you have high stakes, you are talking about something that matters. It matters whether it's with your boss, whether it's in a work environment, whether it's at home with your spouse, with your children. There's high stakes to the conversation. Strong emotions. Usually you have a strong feeling about that. Again, it could be in any environment. And there are opposing opinions. So those three elements form to make what we call a crucial conversation. And what we usually don't realize is that most of our crucial conversations happen with people that we regularly communicate with. It isn't the one and done, the salesperson at the store. Those can happen, but usually those crucial conversations that get under our skin and that we may not feel we did the best job with are the ones that happen on a regular happening. Now this instruction, this 16 hours of training, goes through different phases of a crucial conversation. They look at the before, what do you have to think about before you have a conversation, what are some of the skills that you need to use. Then they look at during the conversation, what happens during the conversation that you need to be aware of so you can shift into a better or more effective conversation. And then what do you do after the conversation? And usually people focus only on what happens during the conversation. Rarely do they think about, I'm going into a conversation I know is going to be crucial. I want to prepare for it in a way that's going to be most effective. So we're going to take a look at some of that today, but just to give you a sense of, if you're wondering about whether the conversations you're having are crucial or not, these three things will tell you: high stakes, strong emotion, and opposing opinions. And the more practice you have with these conversations and looking at these skills, the better you're going to get at it. And actually, I was told when I took the training that if I practice my skills, I will actually look forward to crucial conversations, and I can't say that that's happened. I don't always look forward to crucial conversations, but I do have to say that I use some of those skills, and sometimes on a daily basis. So what happens when we're engaged in a crucial conversation and it's not going well? You know, our body, we actually have physical reactions in our body, and we have a rush of adrenaline, and our brain diverts tough jobs to a reptilian brain, and we get dumbed down. So you've heard that statement, you know, fight or flight. Well, now they're saying you fight, flight, or freeze. And your brain can't make good decisions when all your adrenaline is driving the blood from your brain into those other areas. So you think maybe you're handling it pretty well, but basically you look like a reptile. You don't look like a reptile. You act like a reptile because you can't make those good decisions. And it's really difficult to make a good decision when your brain is in that shutdown mode. So I'd like to share a story about myself and an ineffective conversation that I had that didn't go very well. This was before I was involved in crucial conversations, and it's not a story I'm proud of, but I share it because I think we've all had similar situations. So one day I was coming home from work. And by the way, this isn't my driveway nor is my car, but I kind of like the picture anyways. One day, I was coming home from work. I pulled into my driveway, and who was there but my neighbor, Tom. And Tom, just as background, Tom is my neighbor. He's not my friend. I can't say that we were best friends, certainly, but he was there right at my driveway waiting for me. And he said, "Hi, Joanne, you know, can I ask you a quick question? Do you have a couple minutes?" And I said, "Yeah, you know, sure, Tom. What's up? What's the issue?" And he said to me, "Well, Linda and I," that was his wife, "are thinking about taking Joey to see a movie. What do you think? You know, Joey is 5 years old. The movie he was thinking about was, I'm not sure it was this movie, but it was very similar to sort of a very violent, very scary, you know, movie rated well beyond the 5-year-old range." And Tom is saying to me, "You know, what do you think? Can I take Joey to this movie?" So I'm thinking about Joey because Joey plays with my daughter, and Joey's about 5, and I'm going to be polite here, he's active. He sometimes needed a watchful eye because he could get carried away. And when he was at our house, I always kept a close eye. He's the kind of kid that would jump off the stairway at the top. He'd throw paint around if we were playing with paints. He would torture my cat. He was just really active, but sometimes bordering on dangerous behavior. So I always watched him pretty close. So I'm already thinking things about this question that Tom asked me. Now, my daughter, of course, was perfect. You know, she was that perfect little child, sweet as could be, you know, and an angel, always. So I said to Tom, gee, Tom, you know, the ratings on these movies, they're for a reason. There's lots of violence, blah, blah, blah. Tom says to me, he doesn't say to me, I know everything. I'm thinking he thinks he knows everything. But he says, you know, Joey is very mature for his age, and he really, really wants to see this movie. I'm thinking, your son's a bully. What are you, crazy? He throws rocks at my daughter. I can't even believe you'd want to even think of taking Joey to the movie. And I say to him, by the way, there's a lot of research out there that shows that, you know, violence and exposing children to violence, you know, can be dangerous at some level. He said back to me, well, Miss Higher Ed, because I work at RIT, obviously, well, Miss Higher Ed, you think you know everything. And I'm thinking to myself, Miss Higher Ed? What do you mean, Miss Higher Ed? I can't even believe he said this. And my blood starts to boil. And I am starting to think of things, and my discussion with him goes from one direction right down to a different direction. And I say a few not so nice things about his child, I'm thinking who runs his house, that he's a bully, you think you know everything, you know, all of those things that you think in your head. I don't know why the comment Ms. Higher Ed triggered me, but I went off. I went totally down a bunny trail with some of my comments, and I actually felt justified. I'm thinking, he asked me, you know, he insulted me, and blah, blah, blah. So I brought an awful lot into that conversation, and it ended. It didn't end very well. And I walked into my house and said to my husband, honey, you will never guess what our ridiculous neighbor said this time. You know, and how did I feel? I felt self-righteous. I felt like my perspective was right. But at some level, I was, you know, I knew I'd gotten derailed, but I was a little embarrassed, but not that much. I really felt I had a right to say all of these ridiculous things to Tom. And I think, what happens sometimes when we're in the middle of a conversation, you don't really think, where am I going with this? You just go when you get triggered. So one of the things that happens is it triggers something, and what happens with our conversation is that it gets triggered and you go, what happens is our behavior is the second thing to change. It's our motive. So when I had that comment, my motive went from trying to answer a question that really was a wacky, unhealthy question, in my opinion. But I went to I got triggered, and I went for the jugular for him. And really, the training talks about how do you stay focused on what you really want. And for many people, understanding when their motive changes is very powerful. Because unless you change your motive in a conversation, if that happens, unless you change your motive, and you go from thinking, I got to win this, or save face, or I'm going to tell him what I think, your conversation is doomed. And so, like my story with Tom, you know, there are two parties in the conversation, and I had a role there. So I want to take a look at a conversation between two people and see how effective they are in getting the other person to see their way. This is a short 2-minute video, so see what you think about whether they were very effective or not.
Pressure, you know, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and
So it's sort of a funny conversation, but you know, sometimes your intentions are really pure and they're good. It's just that your motive changed. So for the gentleman in that quick video, his motive really was about getting her to see that she had the nail in her head. It wasn't about listening to her. He tried, but he just kept going back to that motive. And for her, she really didn't want to hear what he had to say, and she just wanted him to, obviously, just listen to her and sympathize with the pain she was having. So sort of a lighthearted way to look at it, but our motives do make a huge, huge difference in how our conversations go. Sometimes we're not even aware that we are contributing to the problem. So I'm sure that I escalated the conversation between my neighbor and myself, but at the time I had no idea. So now we're going to try this, and we'll see how it goes. You're going to use that paper. You're going to think about that frustrating person you had a conversation with in your past. And we're going to try something now to see if you can get in touch with maybe when your motive shifted. We're going to do an exercise that was used by a researcher named Chris Argus. He was a Harvard professor who did a lot of research around communication, and he's since passed away. But he used this actual activity in his lab work with people, and it's called the left-handed column. So on your piece of paper, you're going to draw a line right down the middle, and on the right-hand side, you're going to have the right-hand column and the left-hand column. And I want you to think about someone, and hopefully you already have someone in your mind, who you interact with frequently, who's just plain hard to get along with. And think of the last interaction you had with this person that left you frustrated. Perhaps you didn't say what you wanted, or what you said didn't work. And on the right-hand column, we won't have a long time to do this, but on the right-hand column, I want you to actually write down quickly what you said, so that if you or that other person were to look at that right-hand column, you'd probably say, yeah, that's pretty much what we said in that conversation. So, you know, I said, gee, Tom, the movies are rated X. He said, yeah, but Joey really wants to go. He's very mature, that sort of thing. So take about less than a minute here, because we're not going to leave the space dead for too long, but I want you to just be jotting down that right-hand column, what you said, what that other person said, and maybe get 2 or 3 sentences of what you actually said in your conversation. You're not going to have to share this. I'm going to ask you to maybe share a feeling or two, but I'm not going to ask you to share what you've said. So just do this for yourself. Well, it shouldn't take too long, and you can use shorthand because it's really just for yourself at this point. But we're really looking at, you know, the conversation and how things may shift and your role in a conversation. Now, if you're done with that, or even if you're not, and you can still keep in your mind that frustrating conversation, take a look at the left-hand side of the column. And what I'd like you to put down there, in shorthand, 1 or 2 words here and there, is what you were thinking or feeling, but you didn't say. You didn't actually say these things. So to give you an example, what I wasn't saying, you know, some of that came out when I blew my top with Tom, but really what I was thinking and saying is, you know, why would you even ask about something as silly as taking your child to an X-rated violent movie? You know, I was thinking in my mind, I can't even believe that you're even asking this. What's wrong with you? I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking or feeling. So what I'm asking you to do is put down some feelings or thinking or feeling and didn't say. And when you have some of those in your mind, if you go to the chat box and write down just you know, just a couple of little things that you might have said. Don't, you know, filter it, be polite. But in that chat box, if you wouldn't mind, you know, select all participants in the chat box option, enter a few brief words that you would be willing to share with all. Now, you're not going to give me any identifying information. You're not going to say, you're not going to rewrite the story, but just a few thoughts of what were you thinking and feeling that you didn't say. You aren't paying attention to what I'm saying. You're not listening. I felt frustrated because the person would not give me a definite answer. You made me feel sad and stressed. You are controlling, back off. You're a liar. What are you telling me the details that I don't care about? You know, pretty much just get to the freaking point, please. Why are you getting stuck? Do you care about me at all? So all of those things, you know, are going through our mind. And actually, you guys are very polite, very, very nice. That's because you're RIT grads or RIT affiliated, right, Cindy? Yes. So I think it's, there's an indicator that you, in this short, really honestly, probably a minute or two activity, you could think of a frustrating conversation and you were able to go right to the things that you didn't say that probably were in your mind and that derailed you from the conversation you were actually having. You know, and we're not going to be able to have time here, but the next piece of this activity is to ask yourself, what was at the heart of the conversation that was never spoken? What should you have been talking about that you didn't talk about? So when you think about, you know, come on, don't you get it, or you hurt my feelings, or this is now, you know this is going to impact future conversations, and those are the things that really get at the conversation you want to have with this person. And sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But being aware of what's going on in your left-handed column is critical to the first step in a good conversation. And actually, this activity, this left-handed, right-handed column activity, and you can Google it and find it for yourself, many people do it with teams. So you may have a department that you oversee, or you're part of a department or part of a team that works together, and you may want to try this activity. You know, have people talk about the right-handed and the left-handed column, look up some information on it, and then use it. I've seen managers use it in activities where they're trying to make a decision or trying to come to some clarity around a topic in the workplace. So in your work team, you may have a diverse group. There may be someone who's got a long tenure in your team. There may be a brand new member who may be a little intimidated to speak up. There may be someone from a different culture, or there might be just gender issues. There could be all kinds of things that are an input to why people don't speak up in a team environment. And if you, as the leader of that team or the member of that group, can say, are there any left-handed issues that we are not bringing out into the open that need to be on the table before we move forward on this project? Just familiarizing everybody with that left-handed, right-handed column and then using that in the language that everybody understands could be extremely helpful. Now, obviously, you are not going to say some of the things that I wanted to say to Tom, or maybe some of the things that you've written down here in polite ways. You have to filter it. You're not going to go to that extreme. But there may be ideas that people aren't sharing. There may be hesitations or concerns people have, but they're afraid to share because of the dynamics in the room, or that they themselves are not comfortable. And using this left-handed, right-hand column idea can sometimes open up a conversation. So think about that. And Chris Argus, who was there's some really interesting interviews with him. He was a wonderful person. He developed a theory about He developed a theory about the ladder of inference, meaning, you know, things start to build on others and all of a sudden you're down a different trail than you actually really wanted to go down, or you're thinking in a different way based on what you're not saying but you're thinking. You might want to look him up. Anyway, his whole point is if you don't talk it out, you will act it out. What you don't say but are feeling strongly about comes out in many different ways. And unless you change that and take that left-handed column and take a look at it, your efforts to change the conversation usually don't change. And they are likely to be seen as insincere, shallow, and doomed to failure. So if you're thinking, what are you, an idiot? Or don't you get it? Why are you wasting my time? Your body language is probably saying it, and you're probably showing it in many other ways. It could be your tone of voice. It could be, you know, you turning away, not looking someone in the eye. There's a million ways that this sort of comes out. So moving along, because I want to share some other information with you about awkward conversations, and this actually comes from the Vital Smart people, who are the people that developed this training. This is a training, a research, or I would say a survey, that they did of about 1,400 participants. And they asked them some information about difficult conversations in the workplace. And, you know, let's not be silly here. Everybody has difficult conversations in the workplace. And they all, if you don't, then either you work in heaven or you are, you're not tuning into what's around you. But I think there are difficult work conversations all the time. But anyways, this study in more than 400 participants asked people, you know, do they talk about these difficult topics? 56% said that they have been safeguarding toxic secrets. So if you think about that, of the 1,409 people or so that were asked, 56% of them said they were walking around their work environment holding in information they considered to be toxic. And when they were asked what they thought would happen is if they could actually have that conversation, they could actually have a good conversation, 66% of those people believed that their organization would be helped. 57% believe that everyone who interacts with that person would be helped. 43% believe that the person, him or herself, would be helped. And 39% believe that a huge emotional burden would be lifted. So we're looking at over 50% of these people believe that the work environment would change if they could have the conversation about this toxic topic that they would like to talk about. So what kinds of things do people want to say? The article is pretty eye-opening. It ran the gamut from terrifying to disgusting to actually heartbreaking. And some of the themes included speaking the truth to those in power. 50% of the people were saying, you know, I'm not having the conversation with my boss or boss's boss or manager about what I want to. And actually they give a quote, and the quote is, from one individual is, "You are the worst boss I ever had. I used to fantasize you'd get into a car wreck on the way to work. My heart goes out to anyone who has to report to you." I read that and I thought, holy cow, I certainly hope that person isn't reporting to me. I don't think they are, but I also realize that if you're in your office or your cubicle and you're around the line or wherever you are and you're thinking this about your boss, my heart goes out to you because I think that's a tough place to be. And obviously this is not anything you would actually say to the boss. Another topic was peer performance. You know, one person said, "Your fake, sugar-sweet kindness, tinged with sarcasm and bullying to everyone, as well as your lying and backbiting, has made me not trust you or believe a word you say." So imagine you're working next to someone and that's what you think about them. How effective can your, forget your communication, how effective is the product that you're working on going to be? And if you think that you can set it aside, maybe one the first time, but as these things build, it's very, very difficult. And there were other things, you know, talking about your hygiene or other elephants in the room that people didn't want to bring up. You know, people leaving food at their desk and just all kinds of things that one person said you use the bathroom sink to wash up like a squirrel at a bird bath. You know, so you're definitely thinking about negative things that people are thinking and not saying. There were a couple of surprising things about this study. The first thing was how much pain we're willing to endure in the workplace and for how long, for years and years in some cases, rather than open the vault on these secrets. We're so intimidated by the initial conflict, the actual thought of having the conversation, that we risk losing the incredible payoff for resolving it. And the study also uncovered another issue and problem. These secrets are not truly locked away. When it comes to frustrations, if you don't talk it out with the person and resolve it, you act it out in unhealthy ways. Consider all the people who hate their managers. More than half of them stated that they had either shared their resentments with others or had hinted about it to the boss. So you're maybe not saying it to the person, but you're finding your friend at work, you're finding, you know, a random person, and you're saying these things. So it really isn't that they get shoved under the desk. They do come out in really unhealthy ways. So that's just something to think about. I'm not saying go out and scream at your boss, but I am saying think about what is the conversation you really want to have, what's at the heart of what you really want to talk about. And let's move to some of those skills. You know, focus on what you really want. That's really the conversation you need to be thinking about. You may be talking about something, but what is it that you really want to talk about? And under, you know, our attack, our emotions take over, you know, going back to that reptilian brain, and we become horrible self-monitors. So you need to think about how you can re-engage your brain by focusing on what you really want. So you ask yourself, what am I pretending not to notice about my role in the problem? Are you contributing to it in some way? You know, we usually become blind to our own part in helping to move the conversation downhill, and our motives shift and degrade, and then we are totally ineffective. The second question you ask yourself, why would a reasonable, rational, and decent person do this? Now, you may not think that the other person is reasonable, rational, and decent, but most people in the work environment do try. They do have good intentions. So you might say, why would that person deny me this in the workplace or yell? You know, what's going on for the other person? Why would they act this way? Now, I'm not saying it excuses the behavior, but why? Ask yourself why. And what should I do right now to move towards what I really want? Sometimes that is taking a pause from the conversation. Sometimes it's starting over, apologizing. You know, if you're interested in more strategy and specific strategies, pick up a copy of the book or go to your library. There's DVDs that you can read or you can listen to if you want. And if you're that interested, you can look around for that 16-hour training. I have to say that it's really solid training, and I think you'd find the skills very, very helpful. So although we're not solving the problem of what you should be saying in a conversation, this is the first step. The step is called starting with heart. It's, you know, looking around, being observant of what are those conversations that are going on in the workplace. Listen. Identify them in your own work environment and asking yourself, what is the conversation I should be having? And think about what is your role in that conversation. I want to thank you for your time this morning, and if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you.
There is one, Joanne. From Rebecca, I was wondering, how do we stay focused on the real topic of a crucial conversation when having that conversation with someone who is very emotional or upset or won't calm down?
Well, right there, you're dealing with that one prong of the crucial conversation, that is, when you're very emotional, you know that that person doesn't have the thinking skills at that time. They've sort of shut down and gone into they've gone into a reptilian brain frame. I would, if it were me, I would back off from the conversation. I would say, let's come back to this conversation at another time. And really, in the skill training, they tell you to start the conversation with your facts. If I start the conversation saying, why are you yelling, or I know you're always emotional, Rebecca, you can never seem to keep yourself calm when we get into a conversation, and just once I'd like to have a good conversation, already you're off and running with emotion. But if I say to you, Rebecca, I'd like to talk with you about X, and is this a good time? And then you start by saying, you know, specific facts that are true, not stories that you've told yourself, but specific facts. Sometimes that can help. But when you're initially in a conversation with someone who is really not acting rationally, there is no resolution to that conversation at that time. You need to really take a step back and come at it at a different time.
Joanne, Scott has a question. How do you escape a conversation like this from your supervisor?
Oh, Scott, this is a tough one. I had a boss one time that I had difficult conversations with, and I found myself sending things ahead of time to that boss in fact form. I'd like to talk about, this is the agenda for our meeting, I'd like to talk about this, I'd like to walk away with a decision on this, and then providing some facts. And then when I would get into the conversation, I would say, based on these facts, this is what my conclusion is. And that's the conversation I would have. I can't, you know, if your supervisor is a yeller and a screamer or very emotional, or, you know, at some point, you know, hopefully you can use some of these skills to change the conversation. The only thing you can change in a conversation is how you act. And sometimes that has an impact on how they respond. Many times we don't realize that what we're saying, that the tone of our voice escalates it. And so it's looking at what are you doing in that conversation to de-escalate the conversation, and are you using emotional language versus facts? And you may be, and it may be just a difficult person that's going to be always difficult to get along with. But take a look at the last conversation you had, what did you do that contributed to that ineffective conversation? I don't envy you. It is a difficult place to be in.
David wants to know, how do you get the venting over to let go of the resentment so you can both be ready to listen?
These are questions for your therapist, I think. I'm not sure. These are tough ones. I think it's really helpful to bring this out. You need to get those left-handed column thoughts out, certainly not with the other person, but at least if you can do it at a time when you can sit down and look at how you react to that person. It's probably not that one conversation. It could be years of resentments that build up. So what you're saying in your left-handed column is really about past conversations. It has nothing to do with the current topic that you're talking about. It has to do with the relationship that you have with this person. And I think getting those facts down and stories down that you're recording, I think getting those out, looking at your left-handed column, taking a look at what you contribute, and then trying to come back at the conversation with facts is the only way you're going to do it. You have to get those resentments out because they build up and you trip over them some way. My mother used to say, you bury them under the rug and eventually you'll trip over them, and you really will. I'm not saying you want to get all those resentments out to the other person, but you need to get them out.
You're getting a couple of kudos. You got a nice job. Got to go, Joanne, and thank you very much. Here's a question from Diana. I think you sort of answered it, but let's let's see if there's more to it. Is it a good idea to try emailing a person first to outline conversation topics? Would this help keeping things on track?
Good idea to emailing first. If I were going to email the person, I might say, you know, I would first say, you know, I would set up the meeting first. You know, I'd like to talk about X, can we meet, you know, on Thursday? Or at our meeting on Thursday, I'd like to address the topic without getting into the emotion of the topic. And then I might present a few facts. You know, I'd like to make a decision, or I'd like to talk through the recent decision. You know, here's some of the thoughts, here are some of the facts that I have. I'd like to hear what you have to say. So that, you know, you share your information, your facts, and share your facts, share your perspective, and then ask the other person. Because one of the things they say about a crucial conversation is if you're just going into a conversation to share your opinion or to win the conversation, that's not a conversation. So a conversation should be, you are going in to share your meaning, your understanding of the issue. You're truly going to listen to their understanding of the issue and their perspective. And hopefully by both of you listening, you have better information to go forward. What usually happens is I'm so worried about what I'm going to say that I'm really not listening to you, or vice versa. And if you can get to the point where you can both share your perspective and decide and determine that you're going to make a decision based on both perspectives, that changes things. You know, obviously, you know, everything isn't perfect, and you might be in a situation where you're talking to your boss about it and they really have the final say on whatever it is. But usually the goal is to get both of you sharing information so you both can talk.
So there's a follow-up question from Michael on that. Sometimes sharing your facts is inflammatory. What is the outcome that both parties are seeking, and how do you recognize that?
Well, Michael, sometimes what people think are facts are really, they're really, and this is a whole chapter in the book, so it's hard to go into it here, but sometimes what people think are facts are really stories you're telling yourself about a situation. So, you know, if you said, gee, Joanne, you are so aggressive, or you are so, let's use aggressive, you are so aggressive. I may be pounding my hand on the table, I may be looking away, I may have my shoulders, and you're interpreting that as aggressive behavior. So all of a sudden you think, well, it's a fact, Joanne is aggressive. But that's how you're defining it. It may not be how I'm defining it. I may be sitting with my hands folded because I'm cold. I may be pounding my fist on the table because I am frustrated, but I'm not trying to be aggressive towards you. There are many times that we interpret behaviors as facts when they're really not. If they truly are facts, you know, you stole $100,000 from the company, or well, I'm not even sure that's a fact. That's probably a story. What would be a fact is $100,000 was deducted from our account and put into your account. If you focus on the facts first, many times those are very neutral. They are just the facts. They can be interpreted in many ways. The sharing your story is, here's how I've interpreted the facts. And then the follow-up to that is, help me understand, am I off track on this? Or did you really, you know, did you steal the $100,000 from the company? So it's sharing your facts, telling the other person based on those facts, here's the conclusion I've come to, and then that third step is, what is it based on that? Can you help me understand? Put more of your perspective into the pool so we can understand. And that's, you know, that's the ideal.
Kevin's wondering, is it possible at all to have an open conversation on a difficult topic with someone who has a history of blowing up and getting defensive about everything?
I'm not saying it's impossible, but if the other person isn't willing to have a conversation where you're both sharing your perspective, I think it is very hard. And you know, as I've sort of said, crucial conversation training is training for you. It's what you can do in the conversation. It doesn't mean that you're going to go into every conversation and it's going to be completely successful, or that your perspective and your opinion is going to win out every time. It just means you're trying to build a pool of information that you both can look at objectively and talk about. If you're dealing with someone who always blows up, I would look at what do you do in that situation that escalates it? What can you do to de-escalate it? How can you stick with the facts and the facts and not these stories that might be creeping into your conversation? Like every time you have a conversation with this person, they always blow up. That's a story. They don't probably always blow up, but they do blow up on certain times. So it's a lot of work on yourself first, and trying to then gain some skills that you can use that might have an impact on the other person. Just one final thing I want to say about crucial conversations. It's, you know, you want to have that conversation, but you also want to walk away with an enhancement to the relationship. Because most of the times, as I said before, crucial conversations happen with people who you have continual relationships with. They're not one-and-done conversations. And many people forget about the two pieces to that conversation. The one is to share your information, but the second aspect is to enhance the relationship, so that each time you have a conversation with that person, it gets better. And I hope this was helpful. Is there anything else you want to take for the last few minutes?
There's one question about using humor. Is it a distraction or a useful way to relieve tension?
I would say that humor can be used, but you have to be careful, because sometimes humor can incorporate sarcasm, which is a way of pushing the conversation off the topic of what you really should be having. It's a way of avoiding a conversation. Sometimes humor can be helpful in breaking the ice, but you have to be very careful that the humor isn't taking someone off the topic or moving into a sarcasm, which is really aggressive behavior. It can be hurtful when you use sarcasm in that way. So I would say, if you're serious about a crucial conversation, it can be lighthearted in some ways, but I would avoid too much humor.
Okay, I think that's probably all the time we have. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to email them to ritalum@rit.edu or tweet them to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, and we will get those questions directly to Joanne, and we can get you your answers. As a reminder, all of you will receive an email from us in the next few days with a link to today's recording. Thank you very much, Joanne, for being our speaker today, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us in today's MeRIT webinar. Keep an eye out for an email about our next webinar, which happens next week, as we invite you to take part in the next presentation titled Estate Planning Mistakes of the Rich and Famous. So tune in to learn what you can do to avoid the 10 most frequent mistakes in putting your estate plans together. Check your email for your special invitation. Thanks again to all of you. Please exit this webinar by simply closing the WebEx window, and please let us know what you thought about today's webinar with a very brief survey that will pop up when you exit. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.